They ripped our flyers down like they were peeling gum from a bench. Two maintenance men in gray polos dumping our hope into a squeaking bin, while the student affairs coordinator, badge swinging on its lanyard, watched with that tight, superior smile that says rules or whatever she reads off her phone. Around us, latte foam and polished sneakers, and the buzz of a campus that looks equal until a hand in a nicer jacket decides whose voice gets folded face down. And my grandson, jaw set, tried to swallow the burn in his throat as if dignity was something you could pocket beside your student ID. I stood there with my old leather folder pressed to my chest, the council minutes, 312 names, the map of the posted zones, feeling the hard line between their clean, clipped authority and our paper-thin rights, smelling floor cleaner and cold October air as the digital ticker above us flashed a new neutrality decree like a smirk in lights. And I tell you now, before this hall learns what a record really is, I did not come to win a shouting match. I came to lay down a path so straight the truth can't help but walk it. One request before the next scene: subscribe, comment where you're watching, and share this story. Light spreads when we pass it on. The humiliation was small enough to look like housekeeping and public enough to sting. I stood with my grandson at the student union, a corridor of echoing steps and coffee smells, watching two maintenance workers lift our flyers from the corkboard and slide them into a gray bin lined with a crackling plastic bag. The bin squeaked against the tile. One of the men hummed like he was fixing a light bulb. Above his head, the fluorescent tubes buzzed a steady, indifferent note, turning the fallen leaves tracked in from outside the glass doors into brittle shapes the color of old honey. My grandson's shoulders were square and tight. On the board, the rectangle of clean cork left by each torn thumbtack looked like a small wound. I could have raised my voice. Instead, I breathed in the sour and sweet mix of coffee, toner, and floor cleaner, and unclipped the strap of my leather folder. The folder was dark and soft with age, the edges polished by years of bus rides and waiting rooms. It smelled like stale paper and the soap my late wife used to buy in the winter. Inside, behind a paper clip and a rubber band that had gone from tan to chalky, I kept the student council minutes approving the reflection mural and a petition with 312 names, written and typed and scrawled by hands I had watched trembling and confident and bored. I carried proof the way some men carry talismans. I set the folder on a narrow table under the board and rested my palm on it to steady myself. The coordinator from Student Affairs stood a little way off, half turned toward us, half toward her phone. Her posture said this was routine. She had a badge on a lanyard and the kind of expression you wear when you've had the same conversation too many times. When the maintenance workers pulled a strip of blue painter's tape off the board, it snapped and curled like a little fish out of water. My grandson flinched, and the coordinator glanced up, then back down to her screen. "Excuse me," I said, not loud, not soft, the way you speak to a clerk when you need the right form. "Is there a written notice for this?" One worker looked to the coordinator, and she angled her phone away as if to keep from showing us something private. "There's a climate concern," she said, keeping her voice neutral. "We're suspending all postings related to the event for now."
I noticed her choice of words. All postings related to the event. Not all postings, period. Not because the board was overcrowded. This was targeted, but dressed as housekeeping. I nodded once, like a man absorbing rain. "Is there a reference number for the suspension?" I asked. "A policy citation?" "It's being handled," she said. Her eyes went to my folder, then to my grandson, then back to the worker reaching for the last row of flyers. "We'll send communication."
My grandson's phone chimed.
He glanced down and showed me the subject line: temporary suspension of promotional materials. There was no protocol number in the header, just a generic mailbox name and a timestamp that said 4 minutes ago. He took a quick photo of the board before the last flyer came down. The camera sound, a small click, was swallowed up by the hallway chatter and the hiss of an espresso machine behind the counter to our right. I matched every sound to a step I needed to take. Buzz of lights, visibility. Bin squeak, chain of custody. Email ding, timestamp. I watched the workers stack our materials face down as if to keep eyes off the words even as they were being erased from public view. When one sheet flipped and showed the headline, Reflection Mural, a shared October, the coordinator's hand drifted upward, then fell back to her side. She wasn't a villain. She was a function with a face. That's how injustice often arrives, on a schedule, with polite shoes and an inside voice. I leaned into the rhythm of procedure. The folder opened to a tab marked Policies. Beneath it, I kept a printed page from the manual on expressive spaces. I ran my finger along the paragraph that mattered. Equitable access, posted areas, removal requires written justification. I could hear my late wife's voice, the one she used to keep me steady when we filled out forms for a tax office or a clinic. Write it down before you feel it, she liked to say. Feel it after. The hallway smelled more strongly of coffee now, and someone's backpack brushed my arm with a zipper scrape. A couple of students stopped and read the thin white notice the coordinator had pinned in place of our flyers. It was a single sentence about elevated tensions and temporary measure. The students looked at each other and moved on. My grandson tugged at his sleeve, then checked that our shared drive was syncing. He was my extra pair of hands and eyes, quick with labels and folders, careful with names. I walked the length of the board, counting the other postings that stayed up. Guitar lessons, a tutoring club, a lost scarf photographed on the steps near the library. The light was cooler near the door, and I could smell the leaves outside whenever the glass swung open. Each time it did, a draft lifted a few curls on my grandson's head, and he'd smooth them down without noticing. I took 3 photos, the board before the last flyer was gone, the notice that replaced it, and the maintenance workers loading the bin. I made sure I captured the clock over the coffee counter, the sign on the wall listing the locations of designated posting areas, and the little floor map with its green highlights that said where it was acceptable to communicate with paper. I asked the coordinator for a copy of the written justification. She told me again a communication would be sent. A justification is different from a communication, I said evenly. She looked at my grandson and then at the bin like she was calculating how much time this conversation would cost. She said a form would be issued by administration. She did not give a timeline. She did not cite a rule. She did not step closer or step away. She returned to her screen with the discipline of a person who has chosen to be a wall. We stayed until the last flat-headed thumbtack had been plucked and tossed into a small plastic cup. It sounded like rain on a toy roof. The maintenance workers did not look at us while they worked. They looked at the board, which was their job. When the bin lid thumped shut, I felt it in my chest. My grandson swallowed and nodded once, as if to say he was all right. We thanked the workers for their time because the absence of their choice did not turn them into enemies. Then we turned from the board to the narrow table where my folder waited like a living thing.
I slid the student council minutes to the top. The minutes were straightforward: a meeting date, a quorum, a vote to approve the reflection mural, a line about reserving the posted areas along the east corridor and the quad breezeway. The petition sat beneath, 312 lines of names and numbers and messages that ran from hopeful to stern. I could feel the roughness of the paper against my fingertips and the slight ridge where the pen tips had pressed too hard. I put the petition back under the minutes and clipped them together. My grandson stood at my elbow, his thumb dancing over his phone, tagging each image by location and time. I asked the coordinator the same question one more time, because repetition is its own kind of documentation. Which policy governs this removal? Neutrality, she said, without looking up. We're applying neutrality. I'll need the text of that policy, I said, the version number, the publication date, and the part that authorizes removal without prior written justification. She nodded like someone taking an order she had no intention of filling. You'll receive an update, she said. We crossed the corridor to the information desk. The student worker there had a stack of campus maps and a jar of ballpoint pens with the ink tips sealed in wax. I asked how to file a request for review of a decision regarding expressive spaces. He looked surprised, then checked a binder and handed me a form with a line for attachments and a box for policy citations. I took a pen from my folder, my own, with ink that didn't skip, and filled the boxes with the names of the documents I would attach: minutes, petition, photos, map of designated areas. I left the policy citation blank for now because I didn't intend to guess. When I finished, the hallway felt brighter and more brittle, the kind of light that turns every edge into a boundary. My grandson sent the photos to our shared drive and created a folder called Mural_Procedure Review October. I watched his fingers type and felt the old steadiness return, the one that comes when the next step is known. I closed the folder and slid the strap over my shoulder. We turned back once more to the board, which now looked larger for being bare. The coordinator was already walking away, phone in hand, the workers pushing the gray bin toward a service door that sighed when it opened. The glass doors at the far end of the hall parted and let in a breath of cold air and the dry, papery smell of leaves. I caught the scent of fresh toner from the printer by the desk and the sugar of flavored syrup from the coffee counter. I reminded myself to note those things, not because they mattered on their own, but because they would help fix this moment on the record. The small sound came from my grandson's phone as an email landed, the generic subject line we had seen before. He held it up so I could read the brief message: temporary suspension due to divided climate. No protocol number, no reference to the manual section on equitable access. I angled my body to photograph the little white notice again, making sure the clock and the map and the designated area sign were in the frame. The camera shutter was crisp in the thinning noise of the hour, and the photo froze the quick scuff of a sneaker and the slip of light on the tile. I nodded to my grandson, and he nodded back, a sober rhythm between us. Then the board's digital ticker, the one mounted above the cork and usually filled with lost and found notes and tutoring schedules, flickered once and replaced its scrolling line with a fresh message whose words tightened the skin at my temples. A new internal announcement of an indefinite suspension under a neutrality directive I had never seen. The digital ticker kept pulsing that new language like a heartbeat I hadn't agreed to, so I turned away before my anger learned to speak. The air outside the student union was thinner and colder, bright with a kind of October glare that made the brick glisten. My grandson fell in step beside me, quiet and focused, the way he gets when the problem feels bigger than his height. We headed for administration, a low building that smelled of carpet cleaner and printer heat, the sort of place where doors shut softly and the important things happen on paper.
Inside, the lobby hummed. A wall clock ticked without hurry. Fluorescent lights flattened the color out of everything, including me. The reception desk had a clear acrylic shield and a small bowl of paper clips shaped like teardrops. I set my folder down and felt the table vibrate lightly under the weight of it. My grandson touched his phone to check the sync icon, then met my eyes. Ready? I nodded and asked the receptionist for the form to request a review of a decision about expressive spaces. She blinked at me with a politeness that had been trained into place. Do you have any supporting documents? Yes, I said. Minutes, petition, photographs, a campus map that identifies designated areas, and a copy of the relevant policy. She slid a form through the gap and handed me a pen with a soft rubber grip, the kind meant to say, we care about your comfort while we test your patience. I used my own pen anyway. Its nib scratched faintly and left a clean line. While I filled in boxes, my grandson stood shoulder to shoulder with me, building a folder on our shared drive that mirrored my paper stack. I could hear the quiet tap of his thumbs and the soft whir of a copier behind the door, like a mechanical sigh, each time a sheet landed. A student worker wheeled a cart past with reams of paper wrapped in crinkling plastic. The smell of toner and warm adhesive settled in the air. I sorted our attachments on the desk, the student council minutes on top, then the petition with its 312 signatures, then the photos with timestamps caught in the corners, then the printed paragraph from the manual that said what the board had to pretend it didn't know. I slid each under a labeled tab inside my folder, proofs, policy, chronology, communications, so that when my hand shook later, they would still land in the right place. When the form was done, I asked for a protocol number. The receptionist typed, her nails making a patient rattle against the keys, and printed a small slip. She stamped it with a date and time that felt like a buoy in choppy water. I watched the stamp leave its purple mark, the edges a little fuzzy where the ink oversaturated the fibers. My grandson took a quick photo of the slip, then a second to make sure the time was legible. He named the file receipt_admin_review_01 and nested it under the folder he created in the hallway where our pictures from the board waited like witnesses. Humiliation was not the kind that calls you names. It was this, having to ask 3 times for something basic and being told each time that the answer would arrive later, as if later were a place you could live. I asked the receptionist for the policy citation behind the suspension, not the summary, not the mood, but the rule and the version number. She said student affairs would send a communication. Communication is not citation, I said. She nodded, the nod you give when you're not free to agree. We took 2 seats by a window. Dust most drifted between the glass and the shade. I opened my folder flat across both our laps, and the old leather released a breath of its own smell, deep and steady, like a well-kept coat. My grandson leaned in. We should build a timeline, he whispered, then caught himself and looked away like he'd spoken too loudly in church. He started one anyway, on his screen, a column for time, a column for action, a column for source. I mirrored it with a piece of graph paper, drawing lines with a ruler I kept tucked in the folder's inner sleeve. The ruler had a nick at the inch mark where I dropped it on concrete years ago, a small white scar that reminded me things survive and carry proof of it.
Council approval, date and time, source, minutes. Petition finalized, time, source, PDF with signature count. Flyers posted, time, source, photo with clock in frame. Removal begins, time, source, photos and witness notes. Email of suspension, time, source, inbox screenshot. Ticker announcement, time, source, photo of display. Each line made the rush in my chest slow down a notch, like a valve loosening. My grandson's shoulder brushed mine as he typed, and the warmth of his arm steadied me more than I meant to let it show. "Do you think they're doing this to stop a fight?" he asked without looking up, "or to look like they're stopping a fight?" "That's a question we shouldn't have to answer today," I said. "Today is about what exists on paper." The phone in my pocket vibrated, a message from the student council president confirming she could write a brief statement about the meeting where the mural was approved. I wrote her name under Allies and drew a small square to check off later. Then the ombud replied, "Once a review is filed with attachments, my office will observe and ensure process." That sentence fit into me like a key finding its proper lock. Process. Not victory, not defeat, just the straight line through the mess. We returned to the desk to hand over the attachments. The receptionist slid them into a manila folder with a tab, wrote our protocol number again on the edge in a neat hand, and carried it to a door with a frosted window. It closed with a soft click that somehow sounded like a gate. My grandson exhaled and rotated his shoulders, making a quiet pop like a branch settling. He checked the drive one more time and put his phone down on his knee as if it weighed more than it did. I waited. There is a special kind of waiting in administrative buildings where the air itself feels filed. You sit in a chair that squeaks when you lean forward, facing a bulletin board that still has September's flyer for a professional development workshop curling at the corners. You listen to the slow, threaded conversation of people arguing softly about a budget you will never see. You keep your hands flat and your folder closed, ready to open at any second, like a doctor calls your name. A staff member in a navy sweater appeared with our manila folder and gave me a receipt with a sharper stamp this time. "Your request has been received," she said, professionally timed. "There will be a session tomorrow to go over safety considerations related to your event." "Is this a review of the decision or a briefing on security?" I asked. "A briefing," she said, checking a paper on a clipboard. 30 minutes. Not for presentation of all materials, just context. 30 minutes was not time enough for a fair reading of anything that mattered, and calling it a briefing sounded like a way to keep the room small. I swallowed and wrote the time down anyway. My grandson began drafting a short index of what we would try to show if allowed one page: the policy paragraph, the time-stamped photos, the receipt with the protocol number, the council minutes, the petition count. He worked with careful urgency, the same concentrated look he had when he learned to tie his shoes and refused to accept a loop that wasn't even. On our way out, a corridor opened to a copy room where the air was warmer and the machines clicked and slid like slow trains. I asked a staffer there to initial the back of our photo prints with the date, just to add one more small string to tie this moment to itself. She did it with a tired smile. I thanked her for lending her hand to our record, and she nodded like maybe she understood what that meant. By the door, a poster for a blood drive flapped a little when the HVAC kicked on. The building breathed. I felt all the little humiliations settle on me like fine dust. The way the word climate had been weaponized into a pretext, the way our flyers had been removed face down, the way communication had been used in place of citation, the way time itself was being rationed to make the truth run out of breath. My grandson touched my elbow, a quiet pressure, and in that touch I found a rope back to the surface. We stepped into the afternoon light and walked down the ramp toward the quad, where someone was tossing a football in lazy arcs, and the grass smelled faintly sweet, as if cut that morning. I told my grandson to photograph the designated posting area signs near the breezeway and add them to the folder with the map. He jogged ahead, the sun bright on his jacket, and framed a sign with the bricks behind it so the texture would say where we were. He took a second photo with his hand in the frame, index finger pointing to the printed phrase that mattered most: posted areas for expressive materials. My phone buzzed again. The calendar notification for the briefing blinked into place, and beneath it, a new email slid in with the subject line identical to the last, but carrying an attachment this time. I opened it with the corner of my thumb and felt my mouth go dry before the file even loaded. The PDF appeared with a header that didn't match the university's standard format, and its date stamped today, typed in a font the real documents never used, declaring an interim neutrality directive effective immediately. The PDF sat on my screen like a brick someone had slid into my pocket. My thumb left a damp crescent on the glass. The header was wrong, the font wrong, the tone wrong. An interim directive that looked like a postcard dressed up as law. Effective immediately, it said, as if time itself could be pinned to a corkboard and relabeled. I felt the old tightness in my chest, the one that announces itself without panic, just a slow, grinding clamp. My grandson watched my face, then lifted his phone and photographed the first page with the sun reflected in the corner so you could tell we were outside when we received it. We found a table near the breezeway where the wind moved in sheets and carried a faint smell of mulch and cold metal. Students passed with their hands wrapped around paper cups. A crow hopped on the grass, its beak bright with something it had stolen from a trash lid. We spread our tools, my folder open with its quiet leather breath, the paper inside warm from being carried against my body. My grandson organized the drive by hours now, not just days, a column of folders with names that felt like post readings. 1302, board removal. 1311, email suspension. 1319, ticker notice. 1326, interim directive PDF. I drew a line across a sheet of graph paper and wrote the words we could defend: council approval, petition count, posting in designated areas, removal observed, email received, ticker updated, PDF sent. I left space between each to slide in the pictures so the story could live the way a body lives, with bones and the things that hold the bones together. We added a map of designated areas with a small rectangle marked East Corridor, which still smelled in my memory like damp wool and cheap hand sanitizer. He captured a screen recording of the drive to show the system-generated times, the way the icons winked to confirm each upload, the sequence that could not be wished away. Humiliation was now a layer cake. The top layer was the PDF's cheap suit of a header. Below it sat the ticker announcing a new rule like a cafeteria special. Under that, the email with no protocol number. Under that, the flat-face removal carried out like someone sweeping crumbs off a table while talking about the weather. I felt each layer settle as weight and as proof. My grandson pressed his knee to mine. "We're going to stack it back the right way," he said, not a question. We walked to the history building to find a professor who had offered to observe. Her office smelled of book glue and green tea. A plant on the file cabinet leaned toward the window as if it had something to say. I explained what we had, what we'd seen, what we were building. She listened with a calm I wanted to steal. She wrote her cell number on a sticky note, then clipped it to a short letter she typed while we stood there, confirming she would attend as an observer and, if asked, speak to the importance of process in public memory work. The printer across the hall made a sound like a small train braking. She signed the bottom with the neat curve of her initials and handed me the page still warm. Back on the quad, the light thinned. The smell of leaves grew sweeter as the ground cooled. My grandson bought 2 waters from a vending machine that rattled all the way through its own bones. We sat on a low wall and breathed together. I thought of October years ago, another crowd, another promise of unity that also sliced some people away. Memory does that. It opens a door and a trap at the same time. I held the bottle cap between my fingers, the ridges pressing crescents into my skin, and told myself what I've told myself since my wife died. Hold steady to the thing you can name, then move to the next thing you can name. We returned to administration to ask one more time for the written justification that should have come before the act. The lobby was quieter now, the smell of carpet stronger as the afternoon warmed it. A different receptionist had taken the chair.
Her eyes were kind and careful. She checked the list and said a session would indeed be held in the morning, 30 minutes for safety considerations. I asked if we could have the decision-making path for the suspension. She said she would note the request. My grandson tapped the exchange into our log with the tempo of someone nailing shingles before the rain. I wanted to go home, sit in my chair and let my bones rise one by one out of their ache, but we stayed. We occupied the time the way you occupy a bench at a bus stop, by believing in arrival. He opened our folder, the one that mirrored the paper, and built a one-page index to hand over if they tried to shorten us into silence. He chose each word like a small stone: policy paragraph, council minutes, petition count, photos with clock and map, receipt with protocol number, email and ticker, interim PDF received after removal. I watched his face while he worked. The light from the screen made his eyes look older for a second, then young again when he blinked. We found the ombuds in a small office that carried the scent of old varnish and lemon oil. He wore that professional neutrality like a suit tailored just enough to move in. He listened, made careful notes, asked for our protocol number. He did not promise outcomes. He promised presence. If you file the timeline and the attachments, he said, my office will observe the session and confirm adherence to procedure. Those words settled the way a good floor settles. No creak, no tilt, just a level you can trust for the next step. Evening came like a long exhale, the campus lighting up in bands. We printed the timeline and slid it into a plastic sleeve that clung to my fingers with a faint static pop. My folder grew heavier, or I did. We walked to the union for one last look. The board was clean as an accusation and smelt faintly of cork dust. The ticker still rolled its new message, the pixels a touch uneven at the edges. I took a final photo from the same angle as the first, so the two images could talk to each other like before and after twins. Sleep was a small room I visited and left before it knew my name. At dawn, my grandson's text woke me. A photo of the sky just opening over the library, a thin ribbon of pink like a healed wound. I dressed with the old care my wife taught me, each button a decision made, and met him on the steps. The air had that first cold taste that makes your teeth feel like glass. The auditorium smelt of dust, warmed by lights, and somewhere close, stale coffee and paper cups. We took seats near the front, so my voice wouldn't have to travel far. The session began with the scrape of chairs and the soft feedback of a microphone being adjusted by a hand that wanted not to be seen. I set the folder on the table. The leather made a soft thud that felt clean. Representatives from student affairs in the legal office sat opposite, eyes at that practiced middle distance that isn't quite contact. A security staffer stood by the wall, hands folded in front of him like he was holding a small book. The ombuds took a place at the side, opened a notebook, and clicked a pen once, just once, like a promise. I spoke in the order of the day before. Approval, petition, postings in designated zones, removal observed with photos, email with no protocol number, ticker with his new expansive tone, interim directive received after the removal. I let the paper carry the dignity my voice might lose. Each document made a sound as it left the folder, the whisper of thick minutes, the soft slap of printed photos, the plastic sleeve's sigh. My grandson projected the drive's file list and pointed without flourish to the created and modified times that wrote the sequence in numbers no one in the room could argue with. Student affairs answered with the phrase that had grown teeth overnight: divided climate. The legal representative lifted the interim PDF like it was a badge. I asked for the policy's version number as published before the removal. A staff assistant was sent out and returned with a binder that smelled of clean paper and a little glue. The binder's page for expressive spaces matched the copy in my folder. No neutrality clause, not a word. The assistant hovered, unsure, then slid the binder onto the table so the ombuds could see the printed footer and the date. I placed the binder page next to the interim PDF, their borders touching like two countries that did not speak the same language. The room's noise fell into a hush. You could hear the lights buzzing and someone turning a pen cap in the third row. My grandson didn't move. He was a quiet flame at my side. I felt for a second the settling of a truth landing on his feet. Then the legal representative cleared his throat, leaned into the microphone, and said there was an internal addendum uploaded to a restricted repository hours before the removal, and it would be treated as governing policy. If this moment speaks to you, like it, comment your view, and share. Each click invites another witness.
The words landed like a small stone dropped in water, neat circles widening out from the microphone. An internal addendum, uploaded to a restricted repository hours before the removal, treated as governing. I felt my jaw set, not in anger, but in the way you brace before lifting something that might be heavier than it looks. I rested my palm on the leather of my folder, felt the smoothness warmed by my hand, and asked for the path a rule must walk to become real: registration, approval, publication, communication. I asked for the timestamps and the authorization. I asked where the public would have found it before their speech was taken down. The ombuds leaned forward, steady as a plumb line, and requested the same, his voice careful and unhurried. He asked the legal representative to open the repository on the screen so the room could see the chain of custody for the file. A staffer moved to a laptop, fingers tapping, the projector humming a low electric note. The screen filled with the directory tree that looked like the skeleton of something recently built and not yet named. The cursor hovered, then clicked through folders. Each click sounded louder than it should in the hollow of the room. There it was, a document labeled Addendum_Neutrality Interim V1. The metadata populated along the right side, great text on white. The creation time was precise to the minute. Modified, same day, later. The legal representative cleared his throat and said the addendum was drafted quickly due to developing concerns. I said my concern developed too, and that concern had a smell, floor cleaner, and coffee, and paper warmed by hands, and a time which matched the removal we had witnessed before that file existed for anyone outside this screen. The ombuds asked when the addendum had been approved, by whom, and where the approval was recorded. The staffer scrolled. There was a log entry with a name, a title, and a remark, published to internal, external to follow. The room's temperature felt a degree warmer, or maybe it was me. My grandson whispered that he was screen recording with the device he'd been assigned for presentation to document the sequence the same way we documented ours. His hand was steady. I nodded once, grateful, and thought of how many times in my life another pair of eyes had made the difference between a feeling and a fact.
I asked to place the certified page from the published policy beside the projected addendum. The room accommodated without argument. The binder had that smell again, clean paper and new glue. I slid the page into the light on the table, the tight row of its footer clear. Version, date, cross-reference. The addendum had none of these where the public could see them, and the version code on the internal file did not match the style used in the manual. My folder gave up one more piece without protest, a printout
of the paragraph that demanded written justification before removal. I placed it next to the binder page, like two hands telling the same story. Student Affairs asked for the floor and spoke of safety, of the care owed to all students when emotions ran hot. I said care had a method too, and that method required a reason on paper before an action in public. The ombuds nodded and said the purpose of this session was not to litigate memory, but to measure process. He asked the legal representative whether any public notification had been issued about the addendum prior to removal. The answer was no. He asked whether the manual had been updated on the website prior to removal. The answer was no. He asked whether a written justification had been provided prior to removal. The answer was no. Silence settled for a count of 4 or 5. The fluorescent lights buzzed and someone coughed into a sleeve. The security staffer shifted his weight in a way that made his shoes creak softly. My grandson's shoulder pressed into mine, not tense, just present. I could hear my wife's voice in my head, that simple line she used when the world became fog. Speak to the next true thing. I said the next true thing was that we needed to rebuild the sequence. Not with anger, not with humiliation returned for humiliation, but with the steps that make a campus livable when people disagreed. The ombuds proposed a path. First, acknowledge that the removal occurred without a publicly valid basis. Second, restore access to the designated posting areas according to the published manual now on the table. Third, if an addendum is desired, route it through the regular process: draft, review, approval, publication, communication. Fourth, commit to a public session to document the correction so no one has to rely on rumor. He spoke as if building a bridge plank by plank in the open air. The legal representative listened, brows drawn, then said he would need to confer with Student Affairs. While they stepped back for a brief conversation, the student council president approached our table. She carried a page signed and dated, attesting to the vote and the locations reserved. The ink was still a touch wet where her pen had paused on a looped letter. I slid the statement into my folder under the tab marked proofs and thanked her for giving the meeting of months ago a voice in the room today. She smiled the small smile people wear when they are told they have done something that matters. The professor of public history, who had been sitting 3 rows back, raised her hand and was recognized. She spoke not to the merits of any particular date or commemoration, but to the way institutions keep trust with their communities, by keeping the rules visible and walking in them even when the weather changes. The words were quiet and unfancy, and they landed like seeds on a clean field. I watched a few heads nod, including someone from facilities who had remained standing at the side, hands behind his back. Student Affairs returned to the table with legal and said they could agree to a set of immediate steps. A written clarification would go out, acknowledging that the removal did not follow the manual as published. The designated areas would be made available again under the current rules, and a public session would be scheduled to formalize the correction and discuss how policy updates would be handled going forward. The addendum would be routed through the ordinary approval and publication process before any effect was claimed. The ombuds wrote quickly, then read the items back, each word steady as a nail tapped home.
Facilities requested specific guidance. They wanted to know what would count as authorization the next time someone asked them to take something down. The legal representative said that any removal must be accompanied by a written order referencing the publicly posted policy and version number. The ombuds added that the order should bear a protocol number and a name. The facilities lead nodded with visible relief. He looked like a man who had been asked to carry a couch without being told which doorway it was going through. My grandson, who had been quiet,
asked whether the timeline and attachments could be entered into the record of the session. The ombuds agreed and requested that we send the one-page index and a link to the folder with read-only permissions. My grandson sent the email while we sat there. I watched his thumb move with that careful click of decisions made in sequence. He showed me the screen before he pressed send. The subject line was simple: timeline and attachments for process review. The body listed each piece by name, each with its date and time, like a string of buoys in a channel. We stayed until the paperwork caught up with the words. The note scheduling the public session appeared on the screen at the front of the room, the date and time set for the next day. The ombuds confirmed he would attend and keep notes. Student Affairs said they would draft the written clarification and circulate it for signatures before the end of the afternoon. The legal representative asked for our copies of the binder page and the printed manual reference. The ombuds said the originals should remain with us and the institution could produce its own certified copies. I felt a looseness at the base of my skull, like a knot beginning to give. We stood to leave, and the student council president brushed my sleeve and said she would bring the council's own copy of the minutes to the session. The professor stepped close enough to say she could help moderate a conversation about how memory is held in shared spaces, not as a decision about names and dates, but as a commitment to procedures that allow many truths to stand without pushing each other off the wall. Facilities asked for a template for the written order they would require next time. Legal agreed to provide it. We walked out into a late afternoon light that had turned the bricks a deeper red. The air carried that clean, dusty smell of heating systems waking for the season. My folder felt lighter in my hand, though I knew it weighed what it always weighed. My grandson touched the edge of it with 2 fingers, like he was checking a heartbeat. We crossed the quad without hurry. A breeze moved the oak leaves in a dry, musical rattle. I thought of all the other halls where I had waited for procedures to catch up with people, and how often Mercy and Method had to be taught to sit together like classmates. We paused by the posting area sign near the breezeway, the one he had photographed with his hand pointing at the key words. He took another photo from the same place, not because anything had changed yet, but because this too needed a twin. The before of a correction. I breathed in the thin sweetness of the air and let my shoulders drop. The day had not given us more than it could give, but it had given us enough to stand on. I closed my folder and held it against my chest a moment, the leather warm, the old stitches firm under my fingertips, and then we walked toward the auditorium doors again, ready to mark the next step when it came. The auditorium the next morning felt like a chest filling with air. Warm light pressed through the high windows. The air smelled of dust warmed by bulbs, cardboard from fresh boxes of programs, and the dull sweetness of coffee that had sat long enough to turn flat. My grandson and I took our seats at the front table, the leather of my folder soft against my palm, the tabs inside aligned like teeth. People filtered in with that hush before a ceremony, students in hoodies, a few faculty with notebooks, facilities in their work polos, student affairs, legal, the ombuds with his steady ledger of a face. The microphone hummed a low, even note. I could hear the scrape of a chair leg far up in the risers, the soft cough someone tried to swallow.
The ombuds opened with the ground rules. He spoke like a builder, laying out string and stakes. We would address sequence and procedure, not assign moral weight to dates or names. The point was to clear a path for the institution to walk in daylight. He nodded to me. I stood, smoothed my sleeve the way my wife used to when I was jittery, and opened my folder.
I began where we had to begin. I held up the student council minutes, the vote, the reservation of posted areas. The paper made a clean whisper leaving the folder. I placed it on the table beneath the small lamp so the footer dates glowed. Then the petition, 312 signatures. The numbers written by hands that had pressed too hard and not hard enough. The ridges of ink catching the light. The photos, the board before removal, the clock in frame, the map of designated posting areas, the little square of cork left by each thumbtack like a small scar. The email, no protocol number, just a tone of command. The ticker notice, a digital line that had tried to become law. The interim PDF, received after, dressed as immediate authority, but wearing a header that didn't belong to anything real. I didn't raise my voice. I let the paper carry what my chest could not. My grandson projected the drive on the screen, each file name with its timestamp and the slow fade-in of system metadata. Created, modified, uploaded. The room watched numbers arrange themselves into a story that could not be shrugged off without tearing at the fabric of trust. Student Affairs spoke next. The coordinator's voice was careful, crisp around the edges. She acknowledged the removal had been carried out without a protocol number or a properly published policy foundation. She read a brief clarification drafted the afternoon before, the words deliberately plain. The removal did not follow the manual as posted at the time. The designated areas would be restored immediately, and an internal review was underway to ensure that any future policy changes would follow established procedure end to end. Her lanyard's badge swung once and stilled. I watched the way her hands held the paper, a little tighter than a minute earlier, and I did not hate her. She had been a function. Today, she was a person shouldering the correction of a function. The legal representative took the microphone. He didn't waive the interim PDF this time. He explained the addendum's path, drafted quickly, uploaded to a restricted repository, not published on the public site, not communicated beyond the circle that had written it. He admitted the sequence was wrong. He used the phrase out of order, and hearing him say it out loud was like hearing a carpenter admit a door had been hung on the wrong hinge. He agreed that the addendum would be routed through the normal path: draft, review, approval, publication, communication, before any claim to authority would be made. Facilities asked for clarity, their foreman speaking with a voice that had more gravel than volume. What do we do the next time someone asks us to take something down? The legal representative answered, no removal without a written order that cites the publicly posted policy and its version, bears a protocol number and a name. The ombuds added, and a copy will be handed to the party affected at the time of the act, not promised for later. The foreman wrote those lines on a small pad like measurements for a cut he would make by lunch. The student council president presented her signed statement for the record, confirming the vote and the reserved locations. The professor of public history offered a brief note on how shared spaces carry many memories if the frame is built to hold them. She suggested a panel discussion later in the month, not about winners and losers of dates, but about how communities use procedures to let different narratives stand without tearing at each other. The room accepted the suggestion without applause, which felt right. This was not a day for clapping, so much as for setting something level.
Then the part that would matter to eyes beyond this room. The ombuds asked Student Affairs to read the note of clarification into the microphone and publish it on the website before we left the hall. A staffer typed while we waited, keys clicking in an even tempo that sounded like rain on a tight roof. The coordinator read the text again with the microphone close enough to pick up the faint waver when she said the words "did not follow." Another staffer raised a hand from the back. The page is live. The ombuds asked for the link to be projected. It appeared on the screen, the header and the date and the accountability plain on a wall taller than any of us. I felt the pressure in my chest change shape. Not vanish, but redistribute. Weight becoming structure. My grandson squeezed my elbow under the table. He leaned toward the microphone and asked whether our timeline and attachments could be added to the session record. The ombud said yes, and the legal representative nodded, and the coordinator said she welcomed it. My grandson sent the email while the room watched, the small whoosh of the message leaving unusual in such a space, like hearing the quiet release of a valve. We moved to the physical work. Facilities rolled in a cart with fresh posting hardware and a small level that clicked gently as it moved. We walked, as a group, from the auditorium to the east corridor and the breezeway with the reserved spaces. The building exhaled the warmer smell of heating systems coming alive. The corridor's tile amplified our footsteps. When we reached the board, it looked too clean, like a face after a shave. The foreman turned to Student Affairs. "Is there a written order?" The coordinator held up a page with the protocol number, the citation of the posted policy, and her name. She handed it to me and another to the foreman. The paper was warm from the printer and a little damp at the edges where the tuner had set. Students gathered at a distance, a low buzz of talk moving around us like bees that didn't sting. The workers fixed the hardware, their level showing a bubble that settled dead center. My grandson took photos the way he had before, but now each frame included the visible citation, the protocol, the date at the footer. He took one with his hand in the corner, index finger touching the words that had brought us here, designated posting areas for expressive materials. It felt like completing a sentence we had been forced to leave hanging. Student Affairs handed me a final page, the schedule for the mural, preserved as originally planned. The council president co-signed a note, confirming it. The foreman nodded to his crew. The professor stood a few paces back, her face open and unhurried, as if watching a small town square the corners of a new bench. The ombuds wrote in his notebook. The legal representative stood with his arms crossed in a posture that looked more like protection than resistance. Consequences moved into place without sharp edges. The coordinator would be part of a training to walk staff through the policy steps, not as punishment, but as a fluency lesson. Legal would produce a template order for any future removals. Facilities would not act again without a named, cited order and a copy for the affected party on the spot. The addendum, stripped of its costume, would either become a properly published policy after review or remain what it had been, an idea trying to skip the line.
I pressed the folder to my chest and felt its familiar give. My grandson stood close enough that I could smell the faint soap from his morning shower. The board returned to being what boards are: ordinary, serviceable, something you pass by every day until it matters. When he looked up at me, his eyes didn't carry the same hard question they had the day before. They carried a steadier one. Did we hold the path? We did, as far as we could today. Not because we won, but because the steps stood up under their own weight. I thought of other Octobers, promises that felt like banners and then like borders. I thought of my wife, of the way she would straighten a picture frame with 2 fingers and say, "There, now we can see it," without squinting.
I thought of the words I had said in our kitchen last night when he asked me if it was worth it to fight about paper. Paper is where a public learns to be a public. We stood together in the quiet that follows a machine being turned off. The fluorescent buzz softened as if the room itself were exhaling. Students penned new announcements alongside ours, a reading group, a music night, a food shelf hour. None of those papers argued with ours. They simply shared the wall. I closed my folder. The leather made that small sigh as air left. I knew there would be more days, more rooms, more tables, but today ended where it needed to end, with a rule walked in daylight. I put my hand on my grandson's shoulder and felt the warm, living fact of him. The corridor smelled faintly of dust and coffee and old cork. I could hear janitor's cart roll over a seam in the tile and the whisper of someone turning a page behind us. Peace didn't arrive like a trumpet. It arrived like a level bubble finding center, quiet, decisive, visible to anyone who looked. The goal isn't to win the fight over the past. It's to make room for every memory to stand. If you stayed to the end, leave a like, subscribe, and tell me what you do, especially if it were your family. Until next time,